Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. More reason for George Russell to be seriously concerned about his future at Mercedes, with Toto Wolff making absolutely clear that any proposal that Russell has made to try and get himself a 2-year contract does not fly as far as Toto Wolff is concerned, with Max Verstappen potentially still available for 2027 and beyond. It seems there is no doubt that Russell will not be getting the terms that he wants in a new Mercedes deal that will likely only see him stay at the team for another year to come. Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Plenty we're going to dive into. We're going to start with McLaren. Now, they've scored 617 points over these last 16 rounds. That is 3 more than Red Bull managed back at this point in the 2023 season, with also a rather good car. Now, interestingly enough, if you include fastest lap points, that probably changes, but of course this season there was no such thing as a fastest lap point, so when you remove that, the like-by-like comparison looks something like this. But speaking of McLaren, Andrea Stella made some follow-up remarks on the drama back in Italy, and this stuff really strikes me like, I don't know, digging a deeper hole, some sort of PR damage control, which doesn't really fly as far as I'm concerned. I think the reason why this title fight has been somewhat less whelming, or less overwhelming, whatever you want to say, relatively underwhelming, I think, given the theoretical excellent rivalry that this season should be turning into. It hasn't really worked out like that for a couple of reasons, and a large part of that feels like it's because McLaren are kind of neutering it and want to water down the rivalry. But it doesn't feel like, they feel like a team that's scared of problems emerging rather than a team that's kind of, willing to go with the punches like a winning team, at least in the longer term, may be looking to do. It does feel like the car is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. Not that the drivers are bad, right? They've still been pretty excellent in the most part anyway. But I think people are getting frustrated with the way that McLaren are handling things. Now, Andrea Stella said this: the pit stop situation is not only a matter of fairness, it's a matter of consistency with our principles. And however the championship goes, what's important is that it runs with the principles and the racing values that we have created together with our drivers. It's easy to say that when you've already won the constructors within reason, but when McLaren have competition, which they will next season, it appears to me that there is a certain level of ruthlessness that a team requires, and I just don't know if McLaren really have that in a tightly contested championship battle. Yeah, they won it over Ferrari last year, but it was maybe too close for comfort given the strength of that car last season. So he goes on to say, the situation whereby we stopped the drivers is not only related to the pit stop, it's also related to the fact that we wanted to sequence the pit stop of the two cars by stopping Oscar first and then Lando. We had the clear intent that shouldn't have led to a swap of position. It was only done because we were covering Charles Leclerc. At the same time, we were waiting till the last possible moment to see if there was a red flag or a safety car, so we pursued the team interest. To capitalise as much as possible on this interest, we needed to go first with Oscar, then with Lando. The clear intent was this was not going to swap positions, so the fact we went first with Oscar, compounded by the slow stop, led to the swap of positions, and it was the right thing in compliance with our principles to swap everything back. Now, what you guys may remember from this is that the team radio was broadcast between Will Joseph and Lando Norris, describing what appears in hindsight to be a rather different scenario. Now, thanks to race fans again doing a great job putting together all of the most relevant radio messages from the Grand Prix, and these are the laps where Will Joseph had some interesting things to say to Lando Norris. Lap 34, Leclerc's the car behind Oscar, he's pitted for a hard tyre, it doesn't change our strategy for now. He then a couple of laps later says, okay, do you want to go for the soft? Then on lap 45, Will Joseph says this: Lando, the gap to Verstappen is now 11.1. Lando, we will box this lap onto the soft tyre and I'll come up one, presumably on the front wing or whatever. Do you want to box the other car first, says Lando? Now, of course, there was all sorts of talk about this because Lando had effectively given his teammates the preferable strategy in terms of the undercut potential. But there was two things in play. Norris likely knew that if Leclerc was closing in from behind, it would obviously be to Oscar first in terms of the undercut risk. The reality was there wasn't much of an undercut risk to Leclerc. It existed, but they had a good, 2 more laps probably to cover it. It wasn't an absolutely urgent threat from Leclerc. It was relevant, but it wasn't an entirely urgent threat. But then the main thing for Lando's perspective, of course, is the fact that if the safety car happens, he would like to be out for another lap just in case. The last case that Norris wants is for him to box first, then a safety car happens, and all of a sudden Norris is now third and Oscar's in the lead, potentially, over even Verstappen. So Lando would prefer to say, okay, if that happens, I want to be the one to benefit. You can pit him first just to make sure we don't swap positions, right? So I think that Lando was not making that decision entirely out of the goodness of his heart for Oscar, right? Like, there was obviously some selfish intentions there. But the point is that the team told him, Lando, we're going to box you first. Lando then says, can you box him instead? And then Will Joseph says, all right, we'll swap it around, because I think it probably did make sense to swap it around. The gap between the two drivers was about 3.5 seconds. There was some threat from Leclerc behind. Putting Oscar first made sense in that context. There wasn't too much of an undercut threat to Lando, and equally because Lando is the lead driver, you know, in an ideal world, you want to give him the preferential strategy, which is probably to stay out just in case there's a safety car for that one additional lap. Back in the day, Mercedes, between the, let's say, the Rosberg-Hamilton rivalry, they would have just boxed Lando. They wouldn't have asked him. I mean, to be fair, he didn't get asked. He said, do you want to box the other guy first? But Mercedes would have said, I mean, almost always. I think they did occasionally get this wrong, like in Austria, and it affected them kind of badly, as we remember from that Grand Prix back in the day. But they would have just said, all right, you're boxing, it is what it is. Lando wouldn't have got a choice. So it's just interesting because Stella says, oh no, it was always our plan. That was at least the implication of what he said. We were always going to pit Oscar first, then Lando. But according to what we saw at the time, that wasn't really true. They'd initially told Lando they were going to box him first. He was the one that told them otherwise. So to me, it just feels like an absolute mess, right? And the funny thing about this is that almost certainly they are going to close out the championship next weekend. It's not guaranteed. They need to outscore Ferrari by 9 points. They need to not be outscored by Mercedes by 12 points and not be outscored by Red Bull by 33 points. So pretty much these are the circumstances where they can clinch the championship in Baku with what, like 8 rounds still to go, even with all the sprints in play as well, which is kind of remarkable. But if they want to, they win. If they 2-3 and Ferrari don't win, then they're champions as well. If they 3-4 and Ferrari aren't in any of 1 or 2, as long as Mercedes don't want to, you know, it goes through all the permutations. But not like it really matters. McLaren are winning the championship. It's a matter of when. But it's relevant that they are likely to clinch it at a time where there is further controversy about the way that they're handling things. Now, a couple of things I wanted to say about Red Bull. Max and obviously Laurent Marquis coming in and some of the changes they've made do seem to be yielding some benefit. It seems they've realised over the last couple of weekends that the simulation don't really work, and that Verstappen's ideas are simply better suited to getting the best out of the car. They're now upping power as well on Friday. Historically, they like to use lower engine modes, and that makes sense in an era where engines are less reliable. Let's not forget, right, they will put older engines from the pool in for Friday practice and stuff. So if those engines, you know, go kaput, it's not really the end of the world. You've still got newer ones in the pool, but often some of the older engines, they go into kind of the practice pool and stuff. And there could be issues there if you run higher power, but pretty unlikely. The engines are so reliable nowadays, Honda probably gave them the A-OK. And then running less fuel, it was always a talk from Helmut Marko to say, oh, well, yeah, we weren't really there, but we had more fuel or whatever. But Max is probably of the opinion that, look, guys, we should just see what the car's got. Because if I can tell you what the balance is going to be with more power and more grip and less fuel, as it will be in an actual qualifying sim, then we can probably actually set the car up right, which would be a good thing to do. So it seems Red Bull have figured that out, and to be honest, it's been the case of McLaren all season, that especially in FP3, they tend to push things pretty close to the limit. They run pretty high power. I mean, the amount of FP3 sessions we've seen this season, which McLaren absolutely dominate, more convincingly than they should, because the other teams are not running max. And that's typically the way things have gone, but Red Bull feel like there's more to be gained from that. Yuki has, of course, been struggling. These are just the gap to winner numbers so far this season. That was actually the biggest gap this season in Monza for a Grand Prix win from Max. But as a result, there have been questions as to, well, if things had been different at the start of the season, would it have been possible for Max to have even won the championship? Had they figured out this idea about setting the car up better and all this? Could it have been possible that Max, and it's not over yet technically, but realistically it's not likely that Max can win the championship now. Maybe there was still a world there where Max could have gone for 5 in a row, but right now the chances seem 1% probably that Max actually makes this comeback as it stands. But Yuki's been struggling heavily, at least to put points on the board, but there is talk from McKees that maybe he's doing a better job than it looks on paper. He's obviously not doing a great job, but since he's had more of the upgrades on the car, his qualifying performance has, at the very least, been respectable, I would say. This is what McKee says. I look at qualifying, I would qualify it as a good weekend. He was 2/10 off Max in Q1, and Max wasn't exactly slow this weekend. Then with a small deficit from the car, he was 2/10 from Max. I think he had there was another change that Max had on his floor that Yuki didn't have. So again, like another small thing, but something anyway. And he says, yeah, the gap was bigger in Q3, but he got there. And then he was first on the road in Q3, so that didn't help. And then in the race, Yuki's been stuck in a lot of DRS trains, and he's not been anywhere near good enough in the races, Yuki, in many regards. But the team kind of says, well, long run pace, we've not got clean data, so we can't really tell you what the numbers look like because we're not seeing Yuki drive without damage, first of all, but also without being in a DRS train. So as bad as it's looking for Yuki lately, the way the team sees it is actually a bit more promising. But the reality is that over the next 4 weekends, pretty much until the Mexican Grand Prix, to our understanding, that is when Red Bull will make their decision as to whether Yuki's done enough to keep his seat, and he will certainly have to do far more than he has achieved over the last few rounds. Couple of things on Ferrari. The last couple of days, there's been lots of drama emerging behind the scenes. Top names leaving the team, certainly on the engine and even the aerodynamic side as well. Now, there was a big rumour that Diego Tondi, who's head of aerodynamics, top guy, was set to leave. Now, this would not, if it does occur, be in terms of he wants to step away or he's going to get poached by Audi. It's plausible there's more to it than that. The rumour, anyway, that was growing was that, well, 2025 wasn't very good, this guy's going to go. And to be fair, with the exception of Loic Serra, who they've signed from Mercedes, it's not like Ferrari have made seriously big signings in the last couple of seasons. Okay, Jerome D'Ambrosio, Serra from Mercedes, but apart from that, there was lots of talk about Adrian Newey. That never came to fruition, and now you've got Lars Schmidt and Wolf Zimmermann leaving the team, going to Audi. So there are a few reasons for concern, but Giuliano De Kester says, look, as far as he is aware, there is no chance that Tondi will leave his position. The problems that made the SF25 weak from the start are well known and did not depend on the results of the aerodynamics in the strict sense, and be talking more about the changes they made to the suspension and stuff like this. So it looks like Tondi's not going to get sacked. So I guess there's that from the Ferrari perspective. There are also, just before we discuss this, a lot of recruitment being made by Vasseur, some from Mercedes, plenty of power unit specialists from Alpine. Ferrari fans may debate whether that's the best idea, but what else are you going to do as it stands, right? If you're Ferrari, they do not have all the options in the world right now, especially because many engineers, they don't want to go and work in Italy, right, which can be a concern. Now, speaking of Adrian Newey, there was a bit of talk about this. This article's pretty interesting. I'll leave a link down below if you guys want to check it out, but this was the quote from it on Fred Vasseur and his relationship with the team. Now, let's not forget that Newey probably didn't want to be in the office at Ferrari all the time. He wanted lots of power to veto decisions at Ferrari, and Fred Vasseur, I think understandably, wasn't willing to give him that. But in exchange, Ferrari fans obviously are expecting quite a lot. If you're going to turn down the services of Adrian Newey, which it appears that Ferrari kind of did, at least they didn't give him an offer that was too good to refuse, let's put it that way, there's going to be a lot of expectation there. Now, what's interesting is that Vasseur has a consultancy contract with a clause that allows him to oversee his other business activities. He works on the electric car side with the FIA. He has a company that produced composites in the Far East. You know, he's got a few other things that he's cooking up. And therefore, the article proposes that his presence in Maranello is rather limited, or maybe not rather limited, but simply not what it could be on weeks where there are no Grand Prix. And he's making €8 million a year. And it's just something to think about because, as the article goes on to say, Jean Todt back in the day, he earned a maximum of €5.5 million. Okay, you can consider inflation in there and everything, but his office window was lit from 7:30 in the morning until after 11 p.m. when necessary. So again, here we go, right? From the media, they're calling out Vasseur. We've seen this before from the Italian press, and likely we will see it again. But an interesting assessment that effectively implies, is Vasseur really as locked in on the success of the Scuderia as his previous French counterpart, one could say. But what I wanted to get into before we close out the video was this situation with George Russell, because this last weekend was pretty dramatic, especially the comments from Toto Wolff about Kimi Antonelli being underwhelming during the course of the weekends. Maybe Toto taking a different perspective to the success of his drivers and saying, well, Kimi isn't responding so well to all this lovey-dovey, oh, it'll be okay, you're a good egg, Instead, maybe Toto says, no, you're underwhelming, you performed badly, it's time to lock in. And maybe feels like that's a better measure of management, let's say, for a guy like Antonelli. I guess time will tell. Still very young, still lots of potential. Russell, though, has been arguably the driver of the season. Certainly he's not been far away, whatever you think. I was leaning Verstappen around the summer break. I'd probably still have to leave Verstappen on recent evidence. But Nico Rosberg says that Russell would love a Lando Norris level salary, but he's not going to get that just because of the circumstances around the team. And this is then what Toto Wolff has to say on his own drivers. If a driver says, I would be quicker if I had a 2-year contract, that mindset is not right. So look, we saw the other day, Toto said it's no longer a negotiation, Russell will stay. And Russell said, yeah, I'm going to stay, but the contract hasn't been announced yet, in part because we're still discussing terms. But Toto kind of said, we're not negotiating, it's going to happen. But clearly, there are some terms to still be defined. Now, you could very well argue Russell deserves a 2-year deal if you want to look at it in that way. I think Russell has, frankly, no other options than Mercedes. There's nowhere else he would rather go. He's been a very loyal servant to Mercedes, and in some respects has been rather hard done by in the fact that he could have joined the team earlier and had more success. That was denied. When he did join the team, they fell off. And now they're still in a pretty tricky spot all these years later. Yeah, he's won a few Grand Prix here or there, but next year, of course, would be one of the big attempts to try and win a championship. And he is going to be at Mercedes still next season. But under what type of deal? Because Toto, this past weekend, again, when Verstappen won, literally said to the media, there he goes again, one guy's making us all look silly, running circles around us. There's absolutely no doubt that Toto wants to sign Verstappen when possible. And I also think Mercedes are committed to Antonelli as well. Look, if next year for Antonelli doesn't go to plan, then maybe there are some questions. But even then, I don't think they're going to abandon him anywhere near that quickly. And while George Russell may be excellent, does he have weekends in him like Japan for Max? Does he have weekends in him like what Max did last time out in Monza? Imola, the races that Max has won this year have been particularly spectacular. And yes, Russell did a phenomenal job to win in Canada, but the ability of Max to extract those ungodly weekends is something that probably no other driver on the grid, at least at this point in their respective careers, really has in the tank. My opinion is that if Toto would have paid $100 million to buy Max out of his contract, as what the rumour says, I don't think that would have been worth it for the upgrade that Max would be on Russell. But if I had to choose between the two drivers, obviously I'm taking Max. And if you can get Max relatively cheaply, as good as I think Russell is, then it's something to do. And if you're George, it's not like you've got any leverage in these negotiations. So when Toto comes out and says that effectively my driver is telling me, oh, please, Toto, give me a 2-year deal because then I won't have to worry about it. It'll be a monkey off my back and I can just focus on racing hard. I don't know if for many drivers that logic really applies. Obviously, the driver would like a contract, and yeah, maybe they can relax a bit, but the reality is that Mercedes, it's what they did with Bottas with the 1-year rolling stuff, that they felt that their drivers performed better when there was pressure on them to perform. Let's not forget what happened with Sergio Perez last season. He was given a new contract around Monaco with the expectation that would calm him down and he would level up his performance. If anything, it did the precise opposite and things continued to go poorly. So I get the logic here. And look, if I was Toto, I'd probably do exactly the same thing. But if I'm George Russell, it's like, damn, I tried, right? I went to Toto and I said, please give me a 2-year deal, it'll make me faster. And Toto, it seems anyway, is kind of saying, that doesn't work for me. I'll give you a 1+1 and you will sign it. And if I want to kick you out for max, that's exactly what I will do. So this is probably the inevitability at this point. But if Russell does somehow get out of this with a 2-year deal, then congratulations to him and his agent, because he's done a rather spectacular job. Do I think it's going to happen? I'm far less convinced. But very much interested in your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.